Hello, hi, my name is Siobhan Slevin. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Logic. We are based here in Australia, but we have a global outlook and a global reach. By definition, we are a rules as code company, which means that we look to digitize legislation and regulation and make it something that is tangible, is living, is breathing, and is part of society and of our ecosystems, be it in an organization, be it in society. A lot of people have a view of what rules as code is and technology, and that it is something that is negative and that it is increasing artificial intelligence and not enabling or supporting real intelligence. The main reason why I started Logic with my co-founder Stephen was basically to break that thought process and to show that even though technology can be both the solution, it is also the problem, because a lot of people see it too often as removing the human. But now more than ever in society, the way we are, we need humanity and the human touching our legislation and our legislators and regulators even more so. So we look at digitizing legislation here in Logic, about building an ecosystem, as I said, a living, breathing, responsible digital infrastructure that empowers, it emboldens, and it supports the delivery of legislation into society and makes it meaningful, connected, and effective. It is trying to narrow that gap between the intent of what legislators are looking to enable with the outcome. Rules as code, as I said, is more about the technology of increasing real intelligence in humanity and not artificial intelligence, which is sort of a skewed look that some people seem to think that it's going to be computer says no, technology being ruled by it. So that's how ourselves in Logic, we see ourselves as different. Now that with legislators and regulation, with today's society, with COVID, we've had to pivot. And more so than ever, we've looked at our legislators and our regulators to lead, to move fast and to give guidance. And we would see that having legislation as a digital infrastructure actually supports and enables and turns the dial in allowing our legislators to meet the requirement of society for them to lead in times of change, such as now. We would see that rules as code and utilizing that technology is more about knowledge management and more about enabling our legislators to know what they don't know. It's about connectivity, it's about format, it's having the knowledge at your fingertips, which gives the confidence in the decision making, so you're seeing the whole picture and not just fragments of it. Lots of legislation and regulations are done in silos with different intent and different policies behind it. When you're able to see that in totality, and actually that's where the name Rialta comes from. Rialta is the Gaelic for star, and I have always seen regulations and legislation and your policies and your standards as this sort of big nebulous that seemed very confronting, but very beautiful. So it's not about making things less complex, because legislation is complex. Humans are complex. It's about taking away the complicated. It's about taking away the unnecessary elements that sort of are barriers and there are frictions to putting in place legislation and regulation that is for the betterment. We would see rules as code as an enabler, as part of the democratic process and not replacing it. Legislators and democracy are very important to the point that when you see technology, it's not about taking away the human face-to-face contact or taking away how individuals interact with each other, because that's how we are as human beings. Utilizing technology the way that we in Logic see it, we see it as empowering. We see it as basically getting more closing that gap between the intent and the outcome of what our legislators want for society, and policies that we need to see within our national governments and within internationally. You look at things from a connectivity perspective, human rights, to trade deals, to financial services, this global interconnectedness that we are no longer just citizens of the country that we live in. I'm Irish. I live in Australia. I've lived in London. I've been to America. I've been all over the world, and I'm an individual of in each of those countries, and seeing then how countries interact with each other and how they legislate for trade deals or legislate on human rights, on the environment. Currently, we have the currently in Glasgow, we have all of the global leaders meeting on in the environment, which at the moment we need that dial to change. We need people to understand the impacts of every piece of legislation that they're enabling and how it is interconnected and the knock-on effect. And what we do in Reality Logic is that we take legislation and regulation and we digitize it. And we're not taking away from how the legislation is developed. We're actually empowering it. We are having it in a format that is easily accessible, that is easily analysed, that is easily connected. We take the legal mapping and we take the regulatory mapping and the compliance mapping, and we overlay them, and then we overlay that with computational mapping. And it's this sort of 360 dimension that makes sure that the intent of legislation and that the legislative interpretation is not lost. Because fundamental with rules as code is that when you're codifying laws, that you are not encoding bias or you're not encoding something negative, because that would be detrimental to society and detrimental to the laws that each of our nations are governed by. So we're very cognizant of that in Reality Logic, that we are looking at taking the legislation as it is and digitizing and putting it into a format. It's the same as going from analog, from your VHS videos to your streaming. It's just the laws in another format. We are not proposing to take away the interpretive powers of individuals. We are not proposing that we minimize the use of the courts. We're proposing that we just take our laws and our rules and our regulations and we put them into a format that basically opens access, that democratizes, that allows more people to access the rules, to access the laws that govern them, the laws that protect them, the guardrails that we as a society have put in. So from our perspective in Reality Logic, we see this as it's just the start. It's in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time. Hopefully we will have a place where regulations for anti-money laundering or counter terrorist financing will be connected between all of the different states, that people will be able to analyze and see where the gap is and know that it can be closed. Utilizing the guidance within the UN platform and the different perspectives that people have on how society is developing. We in Reality Logic are trying to embed that within the culture of our organization, that we the impact that we have and the knock-on effect, or the trickle down or up effect that we have, is important for us to own and to manage, and that how we use our company and our skills and what we do with rules as code has an important impact on the future of regulation and legislation and compliance. Compliance itself is a $1 trillion a year business. Companies are getting fined. There's a governance paradox where companies are not adhering to legislation and regulation, and they're getting fined by various regulators. And then it's perpetuating because the regulators then legislate and put in more regulation, which then compounds the situation. where that is a lot of time, money and effort that could be spent elsewhere and have a more positive multiplier effect, where if you take out that governance paradox element, and that you have digitized legislation that is easily accessible, that is easily utilized, and that basically the systems have your back, so to speak, that it allows our legislators, it allows our regulators, it allows companies to be more human, to be more innovative, to actually free up the time that is spent just meeting compliance and regulation, or the time that is spent just getting the legislation to a point where they wish to table it. It takes away all of that and allows for more innovation. It allows for growth and for a positive impact. The vision that we have within Rialto Logic is one that we know is greater than ourselves, and that if we can have just one small positive impact with what we do with regards digitizing legislation, be it in financial services, be it in import export, be it in ESG, that it will have a positive effect. What we see within Rialto Logic is the governance paradox, which basically entities and corporations and organizations aren't meeting their requirements or their regulations, be that from pollutions to financial services to import export to human rights. And then there is more legislation put on top of that legislation. And again, it's this paradox that it's a vicious circle and compliance is not met again. And it's this complex ecosystem that becomes more complicated due to the lack of technology and due to the lack of the ability to see the whole. The knowledge management end of Rialto Logic is very much about connectivity and giving people the full picture and not just the fragments, and allowing them to know what they don't know. And by trying to break that governance paradox where there's not more legislation piled on top of more legislation because the requirements aren't being met, but that now that when legislation and regulation is in place and it's digitized and it's part of the infrastructure within an organization, it's living, it's breathing, it's reactive and proactive. And as I've spoken about COVID and our need to pivot over the last 18 months, 2 years as humans and as a society, having that legislation and having regulation and rules in a digital infrastructure in that format, again, that is about turning the dial. It's about empowering. It's about giving access. It's about enabling people to make the decisions with the whole. And again, this is what Rialto Logic and what our vision is about building an ecosystem of living, breathing legislation as digital infrastructure. We, as I said, we use our 4-layered map of legal mapping, regulatory mapping, and compliance mapping with computational mapping to make sure that we have this full 360 view, and that we can forward reason and backward reason. So as legislators, they can see, or people can see within even organizations, of what the impact of changing one rule will have over here in the left. A lot of people that have that knock-on effect isn't seen, that a new piece of regulation or legislation can have a negative or a detrimental effect on trade, on supporting financial services, on supporting anti-money laundering, on supporting human rights. It just there isn't that connectivity, and that's what we would like to start. We're only small, but that's what our vision within Rialto Logic is for us to start digitizing our legislation and regulation and building it up and layering on our standards and our policies, and getting that conversation going, that we're able to forward and backward reason and go, okay, this policy over here and this policy over here, if they're connected, how are they in the real world? What happens in society when these two pieces of legislation come together? We've had interesting discussions over cloud computing and IP and all of these things that national entities and governments are very, very concerned with. And some of the legislation and regulation is not fit for purpose because it was made and designed and enacted when we didn't have the technology that we have today. And having our legislation digitized allows us to be better at our jobs. It allows us to be better legislators and regulators. It allows us to have more FaceTime, with our stakeholders, our colleagues, our constituents. It allows us to be the innovators that humanity are, and not, stuck in the complexities and the quagmire that regulation and legislation and compliance are. If you look at the cocoa trade, if you look at fair trade, if you look at small businesses, the amount of friction and red tape that cause people to go out of business. The advent of the mobile phone has been phenomenal for that. We're just trying to move the dial and try to get it to a place where having legislation digitized is an enabler. It is not something that is instead of human or instead of the legislative process. I said earlier on, it's to empower. It is to put those guardrails on and have both the ability to innovate but protect society at the same time.